We're excited to have these 30 minutes this morning to look at two pretty different approaches to big data analytics and modeling in cities. We have Mike from Remix and Nick from Sidewalk Labs. And I'm super proud that this is not just another tech panel talking about how cities should deal with technology, but we have also someone from the city of San Francisco this morning to bring us some perspective here, and that is Carrie Bishop, the Chief Digital Services Officer of the city of San Francisco. Well, over to Mike to tell us more about what Remix is doing.
Great, thank you, Christina. Hi, my name is Mike. I'm here with Remix Software. And the important thing to know about Remix is that we are a seller to government. We make transit planning software, been around for about 3 or 4 years. And our core product, Remix Transit Planning, has been helping almost 300 agencies around the world plan bus networks, do detours, do entire system redesigns, really from the ground up, using a kind of map-based planning interface that you can see here on the screen. The really key thing about our work with government is that we really work closely with the kinds of planners, like this fellow here in the photo, who are actually the kind of on-the-ground community experts who understand what's going on in their cities, are familiar with the problems facing residents, and are able to really bring that local expertise to the tools that we provide. Prior to Remix, these people were frequently lacking the tools that they needed in order to make planning decisions. You know, they were working with paper, they were working with Google Maps, spreadsheets, whiteboards, just kind of a smorgasbord of stuff that was really hard to make a visual argument with. What we provide for them is a visual planning environment that allows them to make those kinds of decisions interactively on a map. We're starting to expand from transit into transportation. And specifically into kind of more high-resolution street design. I'm going to stop talking for about 10 seconds and show a brief speed run of our new Streets product that expands from transit into transportation. So what you're seeing here is a very greatly accelerated run through of our new product that allows people to make decisions about bike, bus lane infrastructure, pedestrian improvements, see data from the city in an interface that allows them to quickly make a kind of visual argument about that data in order to convince other people in cities about those changes. And it really illustrates the kind of 3 pillars of our work that exist across the products that we work on. One is that it's very important to use these sketching interfaces to create visual ideas very, very quickly, to be able to show somebody else kind of what you mean or what you'd like your network to look like. 2 is that it puts all of your city's data in one place. We've observed in our research that frequently GIS departments, other types of planning departments are often separate from one another. And so it's important to have a software tool that allows you to see all that data in the same place where you're drawing your decisions about it. And finally, collaboration is hugely important to the people that we work with. It's critical for them to be able to create these visual arguments and then essentially show those to other folks, have debates about different possible scenarios, and kind of get to a best solution in that environment. If the stuff on the screen is interesting to you, we are hiring. We're very heavy users of Mapbox. We use a lot of their high-end GL visual tools for making maps, and you can find us at remix.com.
Perfect. Over to Nick.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm Nick with Sidewalk Labs. Just a quick overview of Sidewalk Labs and my team. So we are an alphabet company. Sidewalk Labs is. Most of our team is based in New York and working on a project called Sidewalk Toronto. So the idea here is we want to figure out how to accelerate innovation in cities. And maybe one way to do that is to actually have a real place where we can run these experiments. And so there's a big development project happening. Our team is supporting that effort, but we're based in San Francisco. And our focus is really on understanding how cities work based on human movement, and use that as create valuable data sets for policymakers. So we have a theory of change on our team. And so how do we make an impact in cities to make the quality of life better for everyone? And so it starts with using better data and better analytics. But that simply is not enough. We have to also improve the way we communicate and gather feedback and incorporate feedback into the planning effort. Hopefully in that process, we will craft better policies and ultimately create better cities. So there's a great opportunity now that almost 70%, 80% of the population are carrying cell phones. There's a constant stream of location data being generated. And so it's a rich opportunity to be able to harness this data to understand the movement patterns and understand why and how people travel. But there's a challenge with it. Obviously, your location history is personal information, and so we have to guard it very carefully. And so the question is, how do we make use of this data without compromising people's privacy? So we put it through a process where we take real mobile location data from real people. We build machine learning models from it, which are essentially statistical models that try to replicate the patterns generally, but avoid all the specifics. And then we generate a new data set, which is synthetic. And the neat thing about synthetic data sets is that it preserves privacy because no one's individual traces are present in the data. It now can be shared freely. So it's hard to have a data set be used in a public process when it cannot be shared freely. So it's because it's not transparent. People won't believe it. It takes the bias out of the data. So even within a large sample set of data, there are going to be biases. So we have to work hard to make sure that we take the biases out. And it provides explanation. So are you going to school? Are you going to work? Are you going out to dinner? And so it adds a layer of explanation so that it can help policymakers make more fine-grained decisions. And finally, for us, these models are structured in the same way that we want to test our policy. So what happens when we do a road closure? What happens when we change the pricing on transit? How do people respond? Because fundamentally, what we're building are behavioral models of how people make choices. And by presenting them a new set of choices, we can see how they might respond. So it's a quick snapshot of what our product can do. So if I select the link on this map, you can see that's the yellow line. And these are all the people that are using this segment of infrastructure. And you can see on the panel on your left, you can look at purpose. So people going home, going to work, other types of activities. You can look at the hour of day this road is being used. You can also look at the mode of transportation on this link. And so imagine you can click on any piece of infrastructure and inspect how, why, and when people use this piece of infrastructure. And this is now the basis of policy making. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, this is super interesting to see those two different approaches. And I now wonder, well, yesterday we also heard from other tech companies like Waze that the living map has left the boundaries of the map and has become the operating system for the cities. And then on the transportation panel, Scoot said that they see every city as a platform. They can't avoid working with cities when it comes to curb space. So I'm wondering, somehow I'm reading this notion here that the city as a machine that can be easily controlled, and somehow that refers a bit as well to what Nick just told us about the replica product. So I wonder how that appears from your side of the table, Carrie.
Well, it sounds utopian to some people, but it's actually like, to me, what breaks my heart most about a lot of the conversations around like city as machine or city as platform is that we kind of are reducing human beings to data a lot. And like, so you say like, we can see why people are taking a journey through data. We can only infer why people are taking a journey. We can't actually know why people are taking a journey, and we don't know what their state of mind is while they're doing that and how they're feeling, and like how we might mitigate or support some of those feelings. And so it's sad because to me, the reason I work in local government and have done for a long time is because I see the city as more of like an organism, right? Like a living, breathing, natural thing made up of like amazing, wonderful, complicated, kind of irrational human beings, right? And that's what's beautiful about cities, and that's what makes cities creative hubs and exciting places to live and work. That's what attracts us to cities. It's not like how smooth and efficient they are, but how vibrant and full of life they are. And I feel like many of the solutions I hear and kind of many of the pitches I get are really like, hey, we can eliminate humans through this like super efficient use of data, and like I'm not looking for that, you know, I'm looking for things that make us more human, not less human. So there are some challenges, I think it's fair to say.
For sure. Nick, do you want to add to that?
Like,
oh, not at all.
As in, like,
At Sidewalk Labs, we struggle with this all the time. I mean, there's half the company that are tech background, and there's half the people that are from government and policy, and so we call this the urbanist-technologist divide, and we have these debates all the time. And I don't think one rules over the other, and they should enable each other. And so we should definitely take a humanist approach, but we also see an opportunity for technology to make to have a valuable role in it.
Of course, yeah. I can see as well that there's really a need for efficient dialogue. And I feel like sometimes this whole idea of putting data on a map and explaining the problem properly is super helpful, and technology allows us to do that as well very efficiently. So in terms of like communication as well, like how do, you know, with the level in consumer applications, the level of technology is, you know, becoming more and more sophisticated. How do you, or how does the city, or how does it, because Mike, you were also mentioning that your product makes it easy to communicate decisions. Like how does this come into this area that we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think in the case of Remix, we've actually been quite blessed to not have to struggle with this debate too much. Because we focused on the humans right from the beginning. You know, really early in the product's creation, 4 years ago, when it was still a Code for America project, we observed that, you know, there's these experts that exist in transit agencies, transportation agencies elsewhere, et cetera, and those folks really know what they're doing. They know what they want. They know what kind of goals they want to achieve. There's a lot of writing about, you know, what a good way to serve people should look like. And so creating tools that helps those people make their case definitely does kind of an interesting and kind of happy end run around the question of, you know, data dehumanizing people, because we're really getting down to that person who has a specific hypothesis about making it easier to travel from point A to point B, or making it safer to cross a street, or potentially reducing pedestrian fatalities in a certain part of town.
I can imagine. What about you, Carrie, in digital services?
I sometimes struggle with as well the idea that, not to say that like roads and transportation and our kind of urban environment aren't important, but also there are much more difficult problems out there to solve. Like in some ways, we're solving the problems that are easy to solve because the data is there, and like they are measurable things, but they're actually not the biggest problems that cities have, really. So in terms of impact on making cities better, actually addressing social issues or some of the issues, and being able to, you know, take a human-centered approach to mapping things, which is not about how are we mapping infrastructure or how are we mapping lots of people through things, but how are we understanding, like, from a homeless individual, for example, what is their map? Like, what is their experience and their journey, and how do we build up maps and data from that perspective, so we're understanding, you know, there are these clinics here, there are these services there. Consequently, like, the way people are moving around the city, that segment is moving around the city is kind of like based around the way where services are provided. Like, questions like that don't seem to feature that much in these conversations, because they're a lot about the built environment and the kind of tangibles that are easy to wrangle. But, you know,
you're hitting a very interesting point here, that you know, there's these data gaps, and what do you do if there is not enough data? Like, I know that probably you have some, you know, solutions or ideas about this. So who would like to mention? Like, I think kind of bringing in different data sources, and you know, then actually that becomes like multi-stakeholder projects between private and public sector. Like, what are ways to kind of do it well, or do it better from in the past?
I think from Remix's point of view, we've really observed two big data gaps. So the first data gap that we've observed is within the city. Frequently, you'll have something like a GIS department or another department who's tasked with maintaining and publishing certain types of data, and oftentimes that data is maybe unknown to the rest of the city, or it's inscrutable or hard to get. And so we have a whole function of the company that's there to help our customers kind of navigate that landscape inside. The other data gap that we've observed is between the city and the outside world. So here in San Francisco has been a real microcosm of this. You had the kind of tech bus brief fiasco of 2012, where the city was looking for information about these new kind of giant tech buses moving through their streets. Now there's a real debate around the use of TNCs, that's Uber and Lyft type companies, on city streets, and how a city could benefit from data about that. We're seeing some efforts around data standards like shared streets, for example, that are seeking to kind of close that gap. But we're thinking that Remix can really help with both of those gaps, that, to help provide planners with a more kind of complete picture of where they're working, not just because they don't know that picture, but also because they have to be able to communicate it to somebody else. So it's evidence as well as information.
So then, Nick, your solution is actually, creating synthetic data in a way to fill up those gaps.
Yeah, I think so. Whenever we identify gaps in our data for either segments of the population or different aspects of how the city works, like TNCs or private shuttle buses, we go look for that data. And so one of our goals is to create as accurate of a representation of a place in all of its various facets, and sometimes that data doesn't exist. And so if there is interest from customers or there's value for us to include it, we might have to go source the data ourselves. And we will source just enough in order to round out an understanding, but for sure, we're, as with sort of any company, you try to do it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit first, and we sort of try to augment it as we move. And so I take the criticism, and I said that's something that we need to improve upon. But we also have to prioritize the work that we do. And it's not like the example that you gave in terms of understanding how different populations move. We have this idea of creating personas in our modeling environment. And so it would just be creating a data collection process and creating these models of looking at how different types of population make certain choices about where they live and where they travel, and based on their destination and their needs. And so this is very much consistent with what we're doing. It's just a matter of prioritizing it.
Yeah,
I think to the point of data gaps, like one of the things that we struggle with as a city, and I think many local governments around the world struggle with, is that those data, like that information, would be super useful to us to help us plan things, to help us understand. Scooters have been I'm sure, a topic of conversation across the last couple of days, but also in general. I think it's interesting to me because as much as you are able to go and speak to those companies or find those data sources, develop relationships with the makers of those transportation solutions or whatever it happens to be, wherever there's a data gap, we're in a difficult position here because we both need to understand this stuff, but nobody wants to tell us that information. Nobody really wants to share that with the government, right? Because our role is to make sure that our residents have an equitable experience, that things don't clutter up our streets and make it impossible to clean and make it unlivable, right? Our role is to actually kind of address that. And so no one wants to share that information with us because the assumption is we're going to shut it down immediately. So consequently, what happens is things appear overnight with no warning. We didn't know it was coming. We were on the back foot. We look like the ones who don't get it. But actually, it's a very tenuous position for us to be in as a city.
I do think there's an opportunity here because, in a way, they're using a public good or public resource. And historically, you haven't had a chance to charge for it or put some restrictions on its use. But we can already see it happening where the curbs, the streets, the sidewalks are not sort of things that private companies could use however they want. And so I think going forward, there's an opportunity to say, okay, if you use it, these are the rules, and this is the data that you have to provide back so that the cities can have access to this data. So I think it's, in a way, there's a gap. So maybe in the last couple of years, we haven't done that. But the next 2 years going forward, I think the hope is that the companies will be sort of required as part of the exchange of using a public resource is to give some of the data back.
Yeah. This was also a big discussion yesterday on the transportation panel, that how to prioritize the use of public space or allocate public space in cities for different modes of transportation, especially as curb space being literally the most valuable real estate asset these days. And I guess we got into that same conversation now. It just kind of proves the point that this is really something that people are thinking about, and that is something where we need a dialogue between the different stakeholders involved. So, we were talking about the various sources, but what are the other challenges that you're seeing, Carrie, at the moment, like working with private stakeholders, or maybe also those community groups that you were talking about?
There's definitely, I don't want to make it sound like, the city is doing everything perfectly and like we're just, grumpy with tech companies. There's definitely not that. And in my role as Chief Digital Services Officer, obviously I have a kind of interface role there to hopefully bridge some of that. I do think we definitely have, not so much data literacy, because we actually have a data academy in the city, and to help our staff kind of become, to understand how to work with data. So, Jeff is in the third row back from our GIS team. So if you want to know more about detail around our GIS approach, then Jeff's the person to talk to. So as a city, we work with data, we work with maps. Like, I think we're literate in that stuff, but what I think we do need on our side is internal understanding of like how to negotiate these things, right? How to kind of build regulations and contracts, like how to be able to, as we were talking about just before the panel, kind of prototype things, test things out before they land. That requires like partnership skills and working with tech companies. We do have programs that bring tech companies into the city. So our Civic Bridge program, our Startup in Residence program are all designed to kind of test ideas out in small ways before we actually land them kind of and roll them out. But it's a large city. There are many departments. Lots of departments it's hard to get departments to communicate with each other. So navigating the city is always a challenge as well. And I think, I understand why some companies just find that totally overwhelming. And like, it's like, well, who has time to figure that out? Like, let's just do our thing and see what happens. I get it. Yeah. It would be the same. So there are challenges on both sides, I think.
Of course, yeah. No, it really sounds familiar. I'm actually from Europe, and I see this a lot in Europe as well. So I wonder if you're actually also, actively going, as a city, you're going out and trying to collaborate with other cities, because that would obviously an advantage that some of the companies could bring in, because like someone like Remix is actually, working with different cities, not even just in the US, but also in other parts of the globe. Is that maybe a strategy for San Francisco as well?
Yeah, especially around disaster response. That's something that the city is very keen on, because regionally, like disaster response is super important. So there are some examples of that, and then there are always opportunities to learn from other cities and compare notes. I think we could do better at that, honestly. But there's also, and if anyone here has worked in government for a while, like there's a kind of notion of like not invented here, which kind of pervades government as well. Yeah. And I think, we have to acknowledge that every city, again, from an uninformed position, it's easy to just look at cities and go, well, they all have the same problems. It's all government, they're all doing the same things. But like the reality on the ground is that culture is very different in San Francisco than it is in New York, than it is in Boston or Philly or like any other city. So you have to, be able and willing to adapt to the locale, right? You have to know and understand, and that means you can't just land in a city and expect your thing to work out of the box. You have to actually take the time to understand what is it about this city? Yeah. What specific problems need solving, and how does our technology do that? And then that's the way into those cities. So sometimes we can compare with other cities, of course, but it's not everything is applicable across the board, right?
Yeah.
I think there's some nuance to that as well. I mean, one of the things that really helped Remix become a viable company in the beginning was a data standard called GTFS, or General Transit Feed Specification. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's an effort put together by Google on one side and Portland's TriMet Authority about 10 years ago in order to get basically transit data into Google Maps. That's become one of the great success stories of government data standards. We're starting to see that type of approach emerge in places like curb inventory and so forth. And I think what that really illustrates is, if you can have a fairly standardized or agreed upon way to publish data about city resources, knowing where property parcels are, or having a list of all the different digital parking meters or curb allocations, it becomes possible to, hopefully in the future, actually drop into a new city and expect things to work in some sort of a standardized way. The issue right now is that these kind of patterns are just starting to emerge. I mean, there's conversations like this one. Kicking off across the bay behind me right now is the annual Code for America Summit, where a lot of government folks are talking about just exactly these issues, and trying to make it possible for cities and tech companies and different people in that environment to network with one another around shared data standards.
I could imagine that maybe Sidewalk Labs is also, in a way, like trying to be compatible with the approach that you're taking here with the model lab and the replica product? Or is it more of a focused effort for the Toronto project?
Right now, we only operate in a few regions. So obviously, as we embrace standards, we try to promote them and we benefit from them at the same time. So it's something that's very interesting and important to us as we sort of scale our efforts. I just want to respond a little bit. I think the role of technology and sort of sharing ideas across regions. I think, in a way, I think that's one of the most interesting opportunities for technology, because cities are very complex places, and having common data standards and sort of ways of presenting information allow people to understand other places and try to borrow ideas and sort of adapt them to their cities. And platforms like Remix, ours, can help people try to look for common threads in places and see how policies actually shape up, and then decide how they might want to incorporate it into their work. And because we operate in so many different places around the world.
Exactly, yeah. I feel like there is this common thread that you just mentioned, that there is really a need for this kind of data sharing, but also like a very much human dialogue between the different stakeholders on the table here. So we don't have time really to do more questions or something like that, but I would love to see this as a beginning of a conversation between the tech people and the and local government. And if you have any questions for any of the panelists here, we're going to empty the stage and kind of meet around behind this wall so we can keep going with the schedule here on this stage. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Nicholas.